Okay, welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Today's featured webinar is tips, tricks, and best practices for physical server and endpoint backup, presented by Veeam. My name is Rick Vanover, Senior Director of Product Strategy at Veeam. I'm going to be your presenter here today, and I'm happy to bring you this content. This has been a really good series that we've been working on, and we've got a great sized crowd on the line here. So let's go ahead and get started. So before I get started, I have three brief administrative points I want to go over. Now, everyone is automatically muted on entry, and a couple of my colleagues just confirmed that the sound is so far so good. If you do have an issue, you might want to switch over to phone line versus the VoIP line. And then if you have a question, use the GoToWebinar question and answer panel or the chat. And I've got some great help on the line. I've got my colleague Natalia, as well as the product manager, Dimitri, for the Veeam Agent for Windows that are going to help me through this content today. If there's a question on the Veeam Agent, especially the Windows Agent, the resources on the call can definitely help you. And myself at the end, I'm going to pick some of the good questions out and read them out loud, as well as take any final questions. And lastly, you're going to like what you see. And this content is being recorded, and the presentation deck will be emailed to you at the conclusion of this week or so. We're going to send that in a follow-up email with a link to the slides as well as a link to the recording. Okay, so let's get started. First thing, I just want to introduce you to Veeam. So Veeam, if you've not heard of us, you should have. But basically, for the last 11 years, we have been, in my opinion, pressing the backup industry for change. We've delivered capabilities that the market has responded to, and additionally, we've really made a difference in the expectations around backup. Now, we were born and we started in the virtualization space, and that's great. We have still arguably the best story out there for virtual machines. But over the years, we added new products and included support for physical servers and endpoints. Well, one of the good things that you're going to see, and I'll hit on this a number of times through today, is that some of the capabilities that were brought to virtual platforms first will apply to the physical server and endpoint backup. Now, that's awesome. And how did we do that? We did it through this portable data format, the VBK backup format. And we'll get through that in a couple of different examples. But the one thing you should take away from this is that if you say yes to Veeam, your expectation is that you can have a lot of innovation delivered to you through frequent updates for both new capabilities and platform support. And these are just the things that changed the industry, right? We have plenty of other things on platform support and base expectations for backup and more. We have a set of products that we collectively refer to as the Veeam Availability Platform. And what those products do are that they provide backup and recovery and replication and failover. Those are the fundamental promises of what we want to provide. And we do that through a number of different techniques, everything from API integrations and automation capabilities, orchestration engines, monitoring and analytics to help you have good visibility on what's going on. And then we want to take these capabilities to all the data sources that you might have, virtual machines, physical servers, software as a service, as well as workloads in the cloud. We're going to spend most of our conversation today around the physical side. So PCs, laptops, Windows tablets, etc. But wherever you want to have your data, chances are Veeam can help you keep it available. And our growth has been incredible. Again, if you've not heard of us, hopefully you have by now. But basically, of all these different numbers, the one that I think matters the most is the Net Promoter Score, plus 73. This is a very strong testament to the satisfaction that our customers have once they say yes to Veeam. So hopefully this is a good intro to Veeam as a company, but let's jump into the meat of the content. So I want to start with just really assessing endpoints and physical servers from a backup perspective. And that's very important because having endpoints and physical servers in the mix is one thing, but when it comes to backing them up and things like that, you have to look at that a little bit differently than you would other things in the data center. So specifically, I'll start with physical servers and data centers. I challenge that physical servers are indeed a first-class citizen in the data center. Now, that being said, myself, I had a very powerful part of my career change because of virtualization, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well, where the virtualization practices of VMware, Hyper-V, and Nutanix, they were very positive things for your career, and your organization probably saved money and had better agility. But there always are things that don't get virtualized. And that's okay, right? I still contend there are situations where you need to have physical servers. And the funny thing is the reasons aren't always technical. Sometimes they're political, uh, possession, management, administrative domain. Sometimes they're licensing. Maybe this product charges a heck of a lot more to be licensed when a lot of processors and systems are in use, which is just inherent of a shared cluster. But then also sometimes performance comes into play. And I'll share with you one quick story that I think is from my own experience, which is kind of funny. I like to say that it was a night and day difference. And basically, what I had was a business intelligence system. And this business intelligence system would collect data from various data sources in the organization. And overnight, it would process all the end of day data and produce some business intelligence modeling based on all those different data sources. And the funny thing is that when it ran on a physical server, it ran overnight and it was ready about 3 a.m. When I ran it as a virtual machine, it literally took night and day. It took all night and into the day. So basically, the business wasn't able to use that data until mid-morning or later. So I like to say that sometimes the performance and the use case of different services and applications can be a night and day difference. And that is my personal story on how that worked. But the reality is there's many reasons of why physical servers are in the mix. So they need to be protected and they need to be kept available. But I challenge that there's also a little bit of a harder discussion to have around endpoints, the data in the small places, I like to say. Gone are the days that all the data we care about is in our data center, everything from cloud services, SaaS, mobile devices, it really stretches the boundaries of where our data is. But I'd argue that some of this data absolutely needs to be controlled as well. And the reality is not everybody's going to follow the rules. And that's kind of unfortunate, but what that means is chances are the contents of the My Documents folder is important on a lot of devices. And you're going to see a situation where some technologies like 5G wireless is going to actually do nothing but exacerbate this problem. And we can go down the path of mobile device management policies and all those other things, but I still feel that the data in the small places will exist. So to the individual stakeholder of your business, some of this data can be very important. So those are the kind of the justification of these two types of data, physical servers and endpoints. But in order to go about the solution of keeping them a little bit more available, or at least more available than you thought you could do, I want to get three guiding principles over to you. And the first of those is actually kind of a loaded topic. Application aware, which that by itself is a conversation, image-based, backup. Now, these three things together are combined with, well, first of all, everything that Veeam has done and the way we look at the market and the way we approach backup is done by these three things just in the first box here. Now, having an application aware, image-based backup, those are kind of three separate things that build on each other. And this is really that highest level of availability for physical servers and endpoints. And from there, we can do all types of things. Now, how you do it becomes important. So that's why I go to the second box. So when we look at incremental backups with forever change block tracking, this is a very, at face value, kind of an aspirational want. And what I mean by that is incremental backups by themselves are very important. They simply require that the next backup after a full backup only takes what has changed and it builds on the backup we already have. In Veeam terms, that becomes the basis of a backup chain. Now, changed block tracking is something that we all have come to know and love from the hypervisor space. But when Veeam entered the market in physical servers and endpoints, we said, we'd really like that. And I'm happy to report that both our Linux and Windows products have a change block tracking engine. And it's built specifically for those different platforms. The Windows Server CBT driver, do your own lab test. I did. It performs just as well, in some cases better, than hypervisor change block tracking. Over on the Linux side of the fence, we've even made an open source change block tracking driver called Veeam Snap. So you can find that on the Veeam GitHub site, for example. So taking the backup has to be a good experience as well, not just a complete experience, which is the first box, but it has to be smart, which is the second backup, or the second box here. And then how we all bring it together and deliver that fundamental value of what we do here at Veeam is simple yet powerful recovery options. And that's where the difference can be made. So let's kind of dissect this a little bit. In order to get to that last box, we kind of have to work backwards and start with just the basics of backups. And I try to think of a few things. I had to limit myself to 9, but what are the 9 things I think you really want from a best practice when you go down the path of backing up physical servers and endpoints? So you can't really go too far without all of these being met, in my opinion. So I'll start with the management, because this is a very important idea. You don't want to go down a path of backing up a large number of systems, especially endpoints. You don't want to go down a path of backing them up without a way to centrally manage them. Everything from central storage resources to fixed policies on when the backup happens, what is backed up, etc. And then you also want to give some consideration from a management perspective around user interaction. Can end users or can other administrators of a system interact with the backup policy you've set? My answer is, probably not on scale. And I'll get to this notion the way we've implemented it of managed by server and managed by agent. That's the way Veeam's addressed that challenge. And then we also want to think about the permissions, meaning, especially in the ransomware era, we don't want to assign too many permissions to anything, right? So I got some tips on that. Stay tuned. And then the second category of things to look at when we do our backups is that change block tracking. That is a very important technology to have very fast incremental backups. This is something that arguably you can enjoy 90% faster incremental backups with. And it's a very important technology because it doesn't just save you the time of your backups. It'll also save you read IO on your primary server or endpoint, but it'll also save you the time in regards to how long your backup infrastructure is in use, especially on scale. And that'll actually open up the door for you to have more frequent restore points. So this is a very powerful, what I like to say, gateway technology. It opens the door for other things. And then you also want to have some storage target management. I think when you think about physical servers and endpoints, you absolutely want to have a very prescribed way from a storage perspective of where the data goes. Where does it live? How long is it retained? Is it or is it not stored off-site? That's a very important portability and kind of policy-based way to think about how you have your backup storage managed. And then storage efficiencies. This is something that becomes a very interesting conversation because a lot of people, when you say storage efficiency or data reduction technologies, what are some of the words that come to your mind? A lot of times people think deduplication or compression. Well, yes, those are two. And then at Veeam, we've actually really built a lot of capabilities around 2 more. The first is spaceless full backups with the ReFS file system. And the second is our WAN acceleration engine. That will allow you to reduce the amount of data sent off-site. So how can I use this for physical servers and endpoints? Well, the way we've implemented our storage efficiencies for our agent technologies, we don't have a deduplication engine per se, but you can enjoy the compression you can enjoy the spaceless full backups engine, and you can enjoy the WAN accelerated transfer. So there's 3 ways right off the bat with no additional Veeam cost that you can actually enjoy some storage efficiency or data reduction technology. Very important on scale, very important on situations where you have a lot of different data types to save how much data you're storing on disk. And then probably the harder conversation comes around some of the applications and the data. Now, this is something over the years I've seen become more and more important, yet layers of complexity and layers of integration become part of the conversation. There was a time when organizations simply wanted file system consistent backups, which is a bad thing in the scheme of things because it really leaves your applications hanging out to dry. So the right way to go about this is an integrated approach to the applications you're using. There's a great framework out there called Microsoft VSS. That's a great start, but not all applications leverage that. And I'll get to that in a second. But when you go down the path of integrating with applications, the next question is permissions and credentials, kind of related to the first thing. You don't want to have the same permissions and credential used for everything. The source data, the backup target, the backup infrastructure, the critical apps, that becomes a really bad practice. I'll get to that a little bit later. And then knowing what files are where. So a good file system index as well is something that's very important to the backup. Then we can look at restoring data. And restoring data is a very important part of the conversation. And what I mean by that is, this is again where it all comes to what I like to say, the delivery of the promise of investing in Veeam. And going from like left to right is from the frequent to the rare type of recoveries. Now, a file recovery, that's what I like to call the daily disaster. I deleted a file, I need it back. Well, that's pretty straightforward. And honestly, if that wasn't something that Veeam was able to do well, I wouldn't be in this position giving you this conversation right now. But we always need more than that. Sometimes we'll need a whole volume, but sometimes we need also the application items. And application items are varied, right? In the Veeam example, we have application level restores available for SQL Server, Active Directory, Exchange, and SharePoint, as well as SQL Server, and then Oracle. So the 2 big database players and a lot of Microsoft applications. And then beyond that, what other types of recovery items do you need? This is where that portable data format comes back in to really, really help us. A lot of times when you talk about physical server or endpoint backup, bare metal recovery is kind of the basic thing that you might need. But the reality is, if you had to do a bare metal recovery, especially for a physical server, today, June 25th, 2019, is back to a physical server the right way to go? Well, maybe it is, but maybe it's time to move it to the cloud. Maybe it's time to recover it as a VM. How about this? You might not have thought about this. Imagine you have a critical application that was a physical server doing something like HR application or payroll or ERP system, something like that. And you as a company have decided to move to a SaaS platform, completely different application, but you need to hold on to that. Why not take an agent backup and recover it to the cloud or as a virtual machine to kind of hold on to it? You can hold it forever that way. A lot of different capabilities with that type of engine, that type of portability. And then, a lot of times I get the question of, why does Veeam focus so heavily on image-based backups? Well, depending on the source data we're working with, so this very much applies to virtual machines and physical servers and endpoints. This doesn't so much apply to SaaS and workloads. Okay, I'll be very clear, we do a different thing over there. But for basic operating system based backups, this is a really great technology, really great approach. It'll provide you simple and fast backup from an aggregated system level. Everything that's part of that system would be included. This paves the way for very powerful bare metal restore that can be done easily. And again, with that portability, you have the engine you need to take the different images you've backed up and put them wherever you need them. And a lot of times I get into the conversation about the cloud with people that, sometimes the reason why people restore to the cloud is because it's the right platform, not necessarily because it costs less or, um, is faster or something like that. It's the right platform for whatever you're doing. And then with those image-based backups, back to that first kind of guiding principle, you might ask the question, well, why is application aware so important? Well, the applications are usually what matters. And in the case of Veeam, we've invested pretty heavily in SAP HANA, SQL Server, Oracle, as well as the rest of the Microsoft kind of big VSS applications. The thought here is that you want to take a backup that's application consistent. Now, this paves the way for granular restores. Now, this is a risk that, once out of a long while, I'll see a situation where in my lab, for example, if I didn't do an application aware backup, in fact, the best, I had it happen with Oracle. I work in a lab where I do a lot of, build up, tear down to kind of simulate a lot of the Veeam capabilities. And I had an Oracle database that I backed up with application awareness. This was during a beta that we had when this capability first came out. But kind of separately, I had an additional backup where I didn't do application awareness. And I actually had to restore it. And you know what? It didn't work. I learned a lot about how to fix Oracle. But that's not what you want to do in a production workload. So you always want to have this application awareness available to you. And in the case of Oracle, we actually went even a further step. At Veeam, we've implemented an Oracle RMAN plugin. So if you have a database administrator, a DBA, who likes to drive their own backup and recovery plans, that can be done through RMAN quite easily. Likewise, with SAP HANA, that plugin drives the backups natively through SAP. SQL Server is still managed exclusively in Veeam, but chances are if you have a DBA in the mix, we can find a way to make their requirements happy. All of that being said, this paves the way for application restores that are very granular, even as granular as a SQL Server stored procedure or an Active Directory group policy object. These are things that you can restore with this approach. And then why do you want centralized management? Well, first of all, you might like what you see with Veeam, so you want to have a way to manage them pretty easily. Now here's a screenshot. This is actually from my lab here. And I like to kind of break it down that I have these three mechanisms over here: individual lists, Active Directory objects, and CSV files. And it's very possible that you might use all three of these formats to set your backup jobs. And let me explain. First of all, an individual list is a collection of system names, computer accounts. I want to have in the Veeam agent management, we call it a protection group. I want to have this list of computers backed up in a protection group. And that's actually what I did with what's selected here. You'll see it says SQL Server Systems, and I have 2 SQL servers in this protection group. That's a list of my SQL servers because they are going to have a separate set of rules regarding their log truncation. They're going to have a separate backup schedule, etc. And then right above that, you'll see I have a SQL Always On cluster group. Well, guess what? The cluster has a different set of rules as well. So that is additionally a individual list. But then above that, I have physical servers. That can be an Active Directory objects, for example. I can say back up everything in this organizational unit. So everything in that OU can be backed up with one protection group, one job, etc. The best way to kind of explain that is endpoints in your environment. If you are really good about Active Directory and have an OU that has all your computer accounts, for example, desktops-corp office. So that means all of the desktops that are in the corporate office are in there, and maybe a separate folder that says laptops-corp office, laptops-remote, etc. So if you have a clean AD structure, you can build a centralized management approach for your backup of those physical servers and endpoints. Really consistent, really easy, clean way to do it. And the last option there is the CSV file. So if you have a systems management system that does everything like patching, updates, deployment, that type of stuff, you can export a list of systems and we can import that and build protection groups from that as well. And once you have a protection group, everything's basically sorted out for you. Veeam Agent for Windows will push out. We can also push out the Veeam Agent for Linux. And then from there, you can build your backup jobs. So getting the backup makes sense, but what about the data backup in regards to offsite restoring and some of the portability? Well, we've got a lot of thoughts on that too. So the first thing I want to highlight as a mindset is that storage flexibility is key. I think it's very important to have a number of different backup targets, different types of backup media for your backups. And we have a very specific advice that I'll go to here in a second. But I think that there's always a need for a central storage resource. That's kind of that first stop of backups. And that central storage resource in Veeam terms is a Veeam repository. And a Veeam repository, quite simply, is where the backups go. And if you go back to the first diagram I had where I had physical servers sitting alongside virtual machines, from Veeam's perspective, they're going to sit on the same management plane, and they are going to, from a storage perspective, go to the same backup repositories. That's a great first stop. That's going to give you the fastest recovery, right? Especially on general purpose storage. That's where bare metal recovery over on the right can really pay off and do dividends for you. But then there's a big press to put backups in the cloud. In fact, I argue that the cloud is a great target, especially if you think about Veeam Cloud Connect, which is a technology that Veeam has made that basically leverages service providers to provide backup storage for Veeam backups. And if you're a large organization yourself, you can even run that as Veeam Cloud Connect for the enterprise. And basically that becomes, lack of a better word, a backup repository in the sky. And if you have mobile workers with laptops, this might be a really good option because mobile systems can do their backups directly to the service provider and they don't have to come back into the office. You don't have to provision the storage either, and it doesn't require a VPN, yet it's encrypted. You want to hear even something better, you can even take an incremental backup while the system is not connected to the network. It's kind of rocket science stuff, but it's very powerful in that you won't miss a restore point for these mobile systems. But it's important also to think about the hyperscale public clouds. Veeam supports both Azure and AWS for object storage. And so that becomes an extension of the central storage resource where we have the cloud tier, which will put backups after a certain age into the cloud. But above all, it's important to have multiple backup copies. How many? Well, depends on a few things, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I'd say for critical server workloads, at least 3. For endpoint data, 2 might be enough, but it depends on what's going on those endpoints, and I have an eye opener here in a second on that. But one kind of guiding principle you can do is Veeam's beloved 3-2-1 rule. And the 3-2-1 rule states that you should have 3 different copies of your data on 2 different media, with one of which being off-site. And if you do a good job about using different credentials, explicit bare required permissions for every role and service, and not using the same account for everything, you'll actually implement this in a very resilient technique. You won't require any specific hardware with the 3-2-1 rule, yet you'll be resilient against a lot of different failure scenarios. You can throw extra credit if you make at least one of these copies of data be offline, and especially for using our Sure Backup technology for virtual machines, you can have no surprises by having backup recovery verification. Now, there's a lot of different ways to implement this. Here are some ideas that you can start with. So both Veeam Agent for Windows and Veeam Agent for Linux can store backups off-site by these ways and more. So removable media, I want to start here because that's harder to manage. First of all, I want you to be aware of that. That's really good for remote devices that are maybe in a robo or home office, that type of thing. But from a central IT standpoint, you have very little visibility other than maybe the backup is happening. And then on top of that, removable media isn't always as reliable as the two or three options to the right of it. So I kind of want to start small here, and that applies mostly to endpoints. Now, then there's tape. And believe it or not, I'm actually shocked how popular tape still is. I'll admit everybody has a story how tape has let them down, but there's a lot of use cases to get backups on tape. And the good news about tape is that from a acquisition cost, it's pretty low, yet it's also very portable. So it can meet that offsite element pretty easily. Removable media could do the offsite thing if you needed as well. But then also backups in Veeam repositories are kind of a good safe bet as well. And the beautiful thing about backup repositories with Veeam is that you can have multiple backup repositories, and you can make restore points on other repositories. Veeam implements that through what's called a backup copy job. It doesn't just pick up files and copy it over. It actually builds you a new restore point, a new chain of backups. But instead of going back to the source data, a physical server or an endpoint, it's going to the backup you already have. So you get the benefit of multiple backup copies without having to go back to the source data and read it again. And then again, Veeam Cloud Connect, the backup repository in the sky, I like to say. It's a great way for you to get backup storage off-site. It can be that great third copy of the data, especially if you don't have access to a second site yourself. So definitely check out Cloud Connect if you're not familiar with it. So I understand that we have a lot of storage options. I understand the need for the backup, but how do I actually do it? What are the different strategies? And I actually want to start with kind of a warning, believe it or not. Physical servers and endpoints are not always what they seem. And what could I mean by that? Well, Windows 10, is that always an endpoint or a workstation? Is Windows Server 2019, 2016, is that always a server? Not really. And I'll give you one example. I know a lot of people that have really small remote sites that have anything from manufacturing equipment to like robotics equipment that will be connected to a computer. And that computer might have an embedded SQL database. That computer might run Windows 10. It's running SQL Express, Windows 10. Is that a server or an endpoint? Well, that application sounds important if it's talking to robots. So systems aren't always what they seem. So my advice here is make sure that you have a good understanding of what you're backing up so that you can make sure that if it's a server or an endpoint, it's backed up correctly. And the big difference is around file system indexing and application consistency. So do your best to have good knowledge of your data so that you don't have surprises like that. And the good news is that Veeam has built these different types of jobs. These three types of jobs are a workstation, server, and a failover cluster. Now, a workstation is just that, image-based backup. This is from Windows. Image-based backup without the application consistency. And in fact, if you were to change the options on the wizard, the options on the left the wizard context will change. A server backup mode will just what you would expect. It would expose the opportunity to configure the application-aware processing, log truncation, things like that, credentials and file system indexing. And then a failover cluster type of job with Veeam is implemented in the thought of it is inherently a server backup. And then I'll get to in a second the notion of managed by server or managed by agent. So that's how the job types are kind of addressed with Veeam Agent for Windows. But from a best practice on Linux, you have similar options. So this is a screenshot from Veeam Agent for Linux, and you have two categories of options, volume level and file level. I personally recommend the best practice is the volume level because it's going to take the whole thing. You know, file level is possibly effective, but think about all the restore situations that might go wrong. And when you do the backup, I mentioned that the application aware image processing for the Windows agent would be a step for servers. But one optional thing you can do for Veeam Agent for Linux is also process Oracle databases in Linux. In this set of options, if you're familiar, by the way, with what we do in virtual machines or even in Veeam Agent for Windows, these are actually the same options. That same logic has been basically ported over to our Veeam Agent for Linux. And it's a great set of options. You can require successful processing of the Oracle database to do a backup. Because if Oracle isn't properly backed up, I might want to say, no, this isn't a good backup. So that's what this option here is selected to do. And then for the Oracle logs, you can schedule those to be deleted or not deleted. And in the case of Oracle logs, if I'm not deleting the logs, this tells me that a DBA is doing their own thing around the logs. And then I can also drop in a credential to prepare Oracle for the backup. So hot backup mode, if you're familiar with that. So whether you're on Windows or Linux, having that kind of server or workstation level approach is really good. But then you also want to think about how the backup jobs are managed. Now, when you make a protection group in Veeam Backup and Replication, you'll get two questions that are very important. Is the backup managed by the server, or is it managed by the agent? So up here is managed by the server. And the thought here is that Veeam Backup and Replication, which yes, that's the product that does backups of virtual machines, but it provides a management plane for the agents. The Veeam agents for Windows and Linux do the backup. That can be managed centrally. So schedules, permissions, application aware settings, where the backups go, where the second copy of the backups go, etc. Or you can have managed by agent. Now, if you have managed by agent, this will actually deploy the software and make sure that a job is set up, but individual computers can manipulate everything from disable, change the schedule. I personally have a preference for the top, but I'll leave that up to you. Now, we've taken backups. That life is great, but what about recoveries? This is where, if you ever need it, this is where you can have a pretty good experience with Veeam. And the way we implemented this at Veeam is there's over 6 recovery options for Windows agents. So bare metal recovery is a great first step, right? Both similar and dissimilar hardware. But also some of the other ones, like exporting as a virtual disk. This is a great way to basically export the backup and then assemble a virtual machine. Good, but the one next to it is even better, and that's instant recovery to Hyper-V. This is a really powerful way to quickly boot up an agent backup as a Hyper-V virtual machine. And for those of you who have been to veeam.com, you'll see that we announced that we're going to bring that capability to vSphere as well. So the demo I did at that event, we were able to, in just like 3 minutes, have a physical laptop backup booted up as a VMware virtual machine in just moments. You also can drive some application item recovery. That's really important as well, and you do that through our file engine here. It'll expose the different restore options: SQL Server, SharePoint, Active Directory Exchange, Oracle, etc. And you also can restore some guest files, and then you can also go right to Azure and AWS. So it's really important to have that portability, that flexibility for those recovery options. But some of the special options also exist on the cluster. So clusters are usually, right, they're very important systems, physical clusters, possibly some virtual clusters. But the good thing to note is that with the Veeam agent for Windows, the bare metal restore of a cluster node works, and some of the other restore options kind of take different approaches. Namely, instant restore to Hyper-V will skip over clustered volumes, and if you export it as a virtual disk, the clustered disk volumes will come back as a simple volume, and then straightforward stuff around file level and application item recovery. And those are the kind of driven recoveries through user interfaces, but both of the products, Windows and Linux, have their own kind of boot recovery media, where you can have a great set of tools. Like we've had a couple of people who need to reset a password, for example, or drive a bare metal recovery, for example. Same over here on Linux, you can restore volumes and files. And then inside of the console, you can take a backup and restore it directly to the cloud. And restoring to the cloud is actually easier than you would think. It's rather straightforward. And the recovery media is one of those things that really makes this happen. So for the Windows agent, we do require an OS whole volume backup. And then during that, the components needed to make the recovery media are collected. If you're going to do a recovery of an encrypted backup, you'll have to have your password, because as we build a recovery media, we don't embed that password. And then you can create that recovery media from your console. So inside of Veeam Backup and Replication, you'll see there's this create recovery media option that sits in the user interface. And that's great because you can drive it centrally. You don't necessarily have to go do it at the agent, at the physical server, at the endpoint. And you're given an option, where am I going to put it? So here's an ISO image generated, and from there you can finish that wizard rather straightforwardly. On Linux as well, there is a recovery media that has special drivers for the hardware involved, and it'll take the kernel modes that are modules that are loaded. So it's going to be very representative of the agent you're backing up. Okay, taking a backup, being able to restore, that's our journey. But what are the reasons you restore, right? Have you ever had to restore for ransomware? Yeah, have you ever had your system go black? Have you ever had a situation where you can't get to your data, or your screen starts doing weird things, right? What do? I have evidence that ransomware happens every day, and there's a number of different ways that you can solve this problem. And I've taken it upon myself to make sure that I can share what I've learned about ransomware to people so that they can be a little bit more resilient. And resiliency is the right word. There's no 100% silver bullet immune to ransomware as long as you're using computers. But I think that a layered defense is going to be the best approach, and a couple of different mindsets here can help you. So I actually want to start with a non-technical recommendation. So I'm based in the Columbus, Ohio office here at Veeam, and we have our Americas Support Center here. I love going down there and talking to the team. I learn something every day. And our SWAT team, the SWAT team is a kind of combination of tier 1 and tier 2. They handle kind of specific sets of problems, including ransomware. And Tim is one of the leaders down there. And I asked him, actually, this was just, believe it or not, this was a Teams message, but it was a perfect quote. So I asked him if I could put it in my webinar. He said, sure. So I asked Tim, I said, hey, Tim, do you have any advice to be resilient against ransomware? And his tip was user education. Have IT organizations train IT users about the basics of virus prevention and safety steps, and also train administrators as well. And just being informed isn't enough. There needs to be, in his words, mortal fear. That may just do it. And I've seen other people recommend things like some of those services that'll send you sample phishing emails. And if you get you always want to lower the percentage of click and open of those types of things. So education is a very important technique, and that's a non-technical one, right? You could probably do that for free with resources out on the internet. But I want above all to know that ransomware can be avoided with education, with protection in regards to how you do your backups, but it's a problem that happens every day. Every day, Tim and his team get calls about that. It's not just a PC problem. It is absolutely in the data center and in the cloud as well. And I want you to go about it that there's 2 ransomware outcomes that are actually not very good. The first is deciding to pay a ransom or to consciously lose data. In fact, Anton Gostev, our Senior Vice President of Product Management, who's in charge of all the backup products, likes to say that the only option you have if ransomware gets in the mix is to restore. And if any of you who have been through a ransomware incident of some sort, a lot of times they'll say things like, I'm so glad I had a good backup. I'm so happy I was able to restore from backup. That's what I see very consistently. And that's not just Veeam situations. I see that across the industry. So make sure you have these outcomes as not being an option. So how do you get there? So the storage conversation, the 3-2-1 conversation becomes incredibly effective here. I put tape at the top of the list here. This is what I would call completely offline and air-gapped storage. So air-gapped, meaning there's no digital transfer. It sounds very primitive, but the physics become important. And the thought here is that these systems are completely offline unless they're being written from or read to. That is arguably the purest specimen of ransomware resiliency out there today. I actually, if you subscribe to the Veeam forums, everyone may have seen the good trick that came out this week, which was just keep 7 days, the nearest 7 days on tape. Because the thought is if you had a ransomware situation knock out everything on disk, a backup on tape from 4 years ago is not very helpful. A backup from yesterday, well, that's a lot more valuable to me. I know it's not a virtual machine or a physical machine, but replicated virtual machines are actually an additional way you can be resilient, a different cluster with different authentication, all of that good stuff. Primary storage snapshots can be used, and these can actually be used 2 different ways for physical servers. Think about a physical server that has a SAN connected to it. You could schedule snapshots on that. You also could have primary storage snapshots on your backup repository. And I have a lot of organizations that use Veeam backup and replication for their backups, and they put their backups on a backup repository that is the old SAN. And when I say old, I don't necessarily mean that it's bad, just maybe they've invested in all flash for primary workloads, etc. A lot of times those systems can do snapshots. That's a great resiliency technique as well on your backup storage. Again, Cloud Connect, it's not connected to your infrastructure. It's a different administrative realm. And if you even consider the Cloud Connect insider protection, it's yet another layer that end users can't manipulate the contents of that data. And then also rotating hard drives. This is also offline unless it's being read from or written to. And there's some more robust options that might be suitable for remote offices, branch offices, RDX drives, if you've heard of those. A lot of options for air-gapped or semi-air-gapped offline storages. But even USB drives can help out. And USB drives, for example, on the computer I'm talking to you with, we have a USB drive that's attached to it. And every day I do at 12:30 in the morning, I do a backup. I'm usually not working at that time, thank goodness. But the USB drive that's attached here to my desk, I eject it when I'm done. This is a very resilient little technique. Basically, once that backup is on the disk, I'm going to eject it. Now, I get into a personal practice myself of rebooting every day after I leave work, simply because, with all the browser tabs open and all the apps that I've been doing throughout the day, it starts to drain a little bit of memory and other resources. So I reboot when I leave. At 12:30, I do the backup, and then the media is ejected through the day when I'm doing my work. That's a great little technique, and this is actually even available in Veeam Agent for Windows Free Edition. So you can very simply and very easily have basically a starting point of being resilient against ransomware. So I talked a little bit about portability, and portability is really important, and we actually made a business change earlier in the year. So we implemented this thing called Veeam Instance Licensing, which Veeam Instance Licensing, actually internally we called it the portable license for a while, because we found that organizations are moving systems around, still doing physical to virtual, thinking about on-premises to cloud migrations, thinking about cloud back to on-premises migrations, thinking about changing hypervisors across VMware, Hyper-V, or Nutanix. Think about running workloads in the cloud, net new, and how things change. There actually was a very big change in what became the right platform to run workloads today. And because of that, at Veeam, we made a change, and it's called the instance licensing, that you can basically have portable across all of these different surfaces. And it does simplify your management, and you can have options that mix both your previous investment and to the new technologies as well. So if you haven't checked that out, you can go to the Veeam blog. We have good information about that there. So if you've liked what you've seen, you can get a free trial of Veeam Backup and Replication, as well as check out Veeam Backup and Replication Community Edition. Now, Community Edition are 10 instances for free, functioning at standard level. So the QR code will take you right there. And a reminder, everyone will get this PowerPoint slide deck and a recording to this webinar sent to you later this week or early next. And as we wrap up, let's go ahead and, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop in the Q&A panel. I've had great help from Dimitri through thus far, but just to give you a sneak peek of what's coming the rest of the year, a lot of good stuff. Enhanced NAS backup is coming to Veeam Backup and Replication, more instant recovery techniques, agents to both agent updates to both Windows and Linux agents, more APIs, more cloud capabilities, and more. So a lot is still coming here in 2019. We gave a sneak peek of some of that at VeeamON. Stay tuned for more. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and go to Q&A. And again, big thanks to Dimitri for helping me out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some of these out, but if you have any questions, just go ahead and drop them. Almost all of them are answered. Great, thank you. One of the questions that came in here is, am I going to get the slides? Yes, you are going to get these slides and a link to the recording. One of the questions was, oh, here we go. Ronald shares that Veeam just saved our keister. I don't think keister is a bad word, so thank you, Ron, due to ransomware. Great to hear. And, you know, hopefully everyone else can say that at some point too. Vijay asks, if we take an image backup of a physical server, does Veeam create the backup file? Now, with that backup file, can we restore it back to a virtual machine on ESXi? Yep, Vijay, that's possible. And soon you'll be able to do that instantly. Here's a question from, let's see here. Oh, let's see, Brian. Brian asked a question that says, I have a physical server with iSCSI LUNs. Can just those local volumes, not the actual LUNs, be backed up and a bare metal restored only for those drives? Yes, you definitely have very flexible restore on that, Brian. And one thing I'll actually highlight, a lot of times I run into situations where people might have a virtual machine and they have an iSCSI initiator configured in that, and they have like a, I don't know, 50 terabyte iSCSI LUN provisioned right to a VM. You're going to want to use the Veeam agent for Windows to back that up because that iSCSI LUN isn't necessarily part of the virtual machine at that point. Dawn wants to ask more about spaceless full backups. Dawn, good question. So just go on over to the Veeam website and look up ReFS, the Microsoft ReFS file system. We have a number of things. I know I did a blog on it. I think I have a paper on it, probably a webinar as well. But the thought here is that if you have the ReFS file system, there's a, I think it's called the block clone API. And basically, if we were to make a synthetic full backup on a ReFS volume, we have the capability to not duplicate blocks. So it's not deduplication, but it avoids duplication, okay? It's splicing words, I know. But basically what it does, Dawn, is it will read existing blocks. Instead of writing them again to make a synthetic full backup, it will just point to those existing blocks. Your synthetic full backups will be basically instant, and they will not consume more IO, time, or space. So definitely check that out. And Dawn, if you want, I'll drop you my email. You can just send me a quick email, and I will I'll send it to everybody. I don't care. I'm a public guy at Veeam. Put it on the Q&A. If anybody has a question, you can email me. I put my Twitter up there too. I do a lot with that. Freeman asks, For backups going to Azure, do you still need to have an environment set up ahead of time? Freeman, yeah, you do need to add your Azure account and the Azure PowerShell. But the best, I actually just did this today, Freeman, because I was recording a video. The best part about it is if you don't have the Azure PowerShell extension installed, you get a message that says what? You don't have the Azure PowerShell extension installed. Do you want to install it? Yes. You'll be done in like 2 minutes. Restart the console, you'll be ready to go. Lots of questions keep coming in here, guys. I'm not gonna be able to get, we had hundreds of people attended today. So basically what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna stop the webinar at this point, and I'm gonna keep the Q&A panel open. So I'm just gonna go through that, but I wish everyone a good rest of the day. I'll get through as many of these questions with written answers only at this point. But on behalf of the Global Veeam team, thank you, Dimitri, for Q&A. Thank you, Natalia, for arranging the webinar. You can find out more at veeam.com. Thank you, everybody. That concludes today's webinar.